Okay, so I'm picking up in chapter 2.3, a disappointment, on the top of page 71. So this is right after Lucy is testifying, and she, without meaning to, is the worst witness compared to any of the other witnesses that get called. So she brings up the joke that Darnay makes about George Washington being a better leader than their leader, King George. And so everybody's, in an uproar about that. And so at the top of 71 it says, Mr. Attorney General now signified to my lord that he deemed it necessary, as a matter of precaution and form, to call the young lady's father, Dr. Manette, who was called accordingly. Dr. Manette, look upon the prisoner. Have you ever seen him before? Once, when he called at my lodgings in London some 3 or 3.5 years ago. So also this lets us know that Darnay has been over to the Manettes since they've been back in England. Can you identify him as your fellow passenger on board the packet or speak to his conversation with your daughter? Sir, I can do neither. Is there any particular and special reason for your being unable to do either? He answered in a low voice, There is. Has it been your misfortune to undergo a long imprisonment without trial or even accusation in your native country, Dr. Manette? He answered in a tone that went to every heart, A long imprisonment. Were you newly released on the occasion in question? They tell me so. Have you no remembrance of the occasion? None. My mind is blank from some time, I cannot even say what time, when I employed myself in my captivity in making shoes, to the time when I found myself living in London with my dear daughter here. So he has no recollection, total memory loss about that time, in between, like when Lucy came to get him and bring him back to England. He thought he was 105 North Tower, but obviously he's been recalled to life at this point. She had become familiar to me when a gracious God restored my faculties, but I am quite unable even to say how she had become familiar. I have no remembrance of the process. Mr. Attorney General sat down, and the father and daughter sat down together. So this is where the chapter takes a total change, and you have to pay really close attention. A singular circumstance then arose in the case, the object in hand being to show that the prisoner went down with some fellow plotter untracked in the Dover mail on that Friday night, November, 5 years ago, and got out of the mail in the night as a blind at a place where he did not remain, but from which he traveled back some dozen miles or more to a garrison and dockyard, and there collected information. A witness was called to identify him as having been at the precise time required in the coffee room of a hotel in the garrison and dockyard town, waiting for another person. The prisoner's counsel was cross-examining the witness with no result, except that he had never seen the prisoner on any other occasion, when the wigged gentleman, who had all this time been looking at the ceiling of the court, so that's Sidney Carton, wrote a word or two on a little piece of paper, screwed it up, or crumples it up, and tossed it to him. Opening this piece of paper in the next pause, the counsel, Mr. Stryver, looked with great attention and curiosity at the prisoner. Okay, so what they're trying to prove is that night where Mr. Lorry was traveling to Dover, that Darnay was one of those people sitting on the carriage. So that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to place him there. So Stryver is examining this witness, and all of a sudden Sidney Carton writes something down on a piece of paper, tosses it over to Stryver. Stryver opens it, and now he's going to do something with it. So, you say that you are quite sure that it was the prisoner, says Stryver. The witness was quite sure. Did you ever see anybody very like the prisoner? Meaning, have you ever seen anybody that looks like the prisoner? Not so like, the witness said, as he could be mistaken. Look well upon that gentleman, my learned friend there. So all of a sudden he points to Carton, sitting over on the side. Pointing to him who had tossed the paper over. And then look well upon the prisoner. How say you? Are they very like each other? allowing for my learned friend's appearance being careless and slovenly, if not debauched, they were sufficiently like each other to surprise not only the witness, but everybody present, when they were thus brought into comparison. So, Carton makes the recognition that he and Darnay look very, very similar. The differences are that Carton is a little bit more rough around the edges. He's sort of like the bad boy version of Charles Darnay. But they look very, very similar. So think about Tale of Two Cities, think about doubles and twos, and we just, we talked about a mirror that was being held over Darnay to there's this idea of the double. And so here we go, Carton and Darnay look really similar. And so bringing this up, what that means is it introduces, and this is a legal term, something called reasonable doubt into the jury's mind. So the idea is that you can't 100% say that it was Charles Darnay that was aboard the Dover Mail that night. It could have been Sidney Carton, and if it could have been Sidney Carton, it could have been anybody. So just, introducing that doubt is going to help him. So, I'm jumping down on 72 to the last paragraph. It says, Mr. Cruncher had by that time taken quite a lunch of rust off his fingers, Jerry Cruncher disgusting in his following of the evidence. He had now to attend while Mr. Stryver fitted the prisoner's case on the jury like a compact suit of clothes, showing them how the patriot, Barsad, so first witness, was a hired spy and traitor, an unblushing trafficker in blood, and one of the greatest scoundrels upon earth since accursed Judas, which he certainly did look rather like. How the virtuous Cly, second witness, was his friend and partner, and was worthy to be, how the watchful eyes of those forgers and false swearers had rested on the prisoner as a victim, because some family affairs in France, he being of French extraction, did require his making those passages across the channel, though what those affairs were, consideration for others who were near and dear to him, forbade him even for his life to disclose. So, Stryver's wrapping this up, proving that Barsad and Cly were spies. So really, they're closer to being traitors than Charles Darnay is. How the evidence that had been warped and wrested from the young lady, whose anguish in giving it they had witnessed, came to nothing, involving the mere little innocent gallantries and politeness likely to pass between any young gentleman and young lady so thrown together, with the exception of that reference to George Washington, which was altogether too extravagant and impossible to be regarded in any other light than a monstrous joke. And Lucy and Darnay are just flirting. That's what their conversation was about. And then obviously the George Washington stuff on Darnay's part was just a joke, says Stryver. How could it be a weakness in the government to break down in this attempt to practice the popularity on the lowest national antipathies and fears? Therefore, Mr. Attorney General had made the most of it. How, nevertheless, it rested upon nothing save that vile and infamous character of evidence, too often disfiguring such cases, and of which the state trials of this country were full. But there my lord interposed with as grave a face as if it had not been true, saying that he could not sit upon that bench and suffer those illusions. Mr. Stryver then called his few witnesses, and Mr. Cruncher had next to attend while Mr. Attorney General turned the whole suit of clothes Mr. Stryver had fitted on the jury inside out, showing how Barsad and Cly were even 100 times better than he had thought them, and the prisoner 100 times worse. Lastly came my lord himself, turning the suit of clothes now inside out, now inside in, but on the whole decidedly trimming and shaping them into the grave clothes for the prisoner. So like the back and forth that happens in a trial. Now, the jury turned to consider, and the great flies swarmed again. This is also important. Mr. Carton, and I think that this is the second time we've heard his name. So Mr. Carton, who had so long sat looking at the ceiling of the court, changed neither his place nor his attitude, even in this excitement, while his learned friend, Mr. Stryver, massing his papers before him, whispered with those who sat near, and from time to time glanced anxiously at the jury, while all the spectators moved more or less and grouped themselves anew, while even my lord himself arose from his seat and slowly paced up and down his platform, not unattended by a suspicion in the minds and audience that his state was feverish. This one man sat leaning back with his torn gown half off him, his untidy wig put on just as it happened to light on his head after its removal, and his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the ceiling as they had been all day. So again, much more rough around the edges, kind of like sloppily dressed. Something especially reckless in his demeanor, that's a good word for it, reckless, not only gave him a disreputable look, but so diminished the strong resemblance he undoubtedly bore to the prisoner, which his momentary earnestness, when they were compared together, had strengthened, that many of the onlookers, taking note of him now, said to one another that they could hardly have thought that the two were so alike. Mr. Cruncher made the observation to his next neighbor and added, "I'd hold half a guinea that he don't get no law work to do. Don't look like the sort of one to get any, do he? Yet," this is very important, "this Mr. Carton took in more of the details of the scene than he appeared to take in. For now, when Miss Manette's head dropped upon her father's breast, Lucy faints, he was the first to see it and say audibly, 'Officer, look to that young lady. Help the gentleman to take her out. Don't you see that she will fall?'" So here's a guy who appears to not be paying attention, appears disinterested, appears reckless, appears to not pay attention. And yet, what we just heard, he's the very first person to see that Lucy faints and she's about to fall and hit herself on the floor unless somebody rushes to her. We've also heard about somebody else that takes in more of the scene than she lets on. So think about that whole appearance versus reality thing. Picking back up on 74, there was much commiseration for her as she was removed and much sympathy with her father. But it had evidently been a great distress to him to have the day of his imprisonment recalled. He had shown strong internal agitation when he was questioned, and that pondering or brooding look which made him old had been upon him like a heavy cloud back over Manette ever since. As he passed out, the jury, who had turned back and paused a moment, spoke through their foreman. They had not agreed and wished to retire. My lord, perhaps with George Washington on his mind, showed some surprise that they were not agreed, but signified his pleasure that they should retire under watch and ward, and retired himself. The trial had lasted all day, and the lamps in the court were now being lighted. It began to be rumored that the jury would be out a long while. The spectators dropped off to get refreshment, and the prisoner withdrew to the back of the dock and sat down. Mr. Lorry, who had gone out when the young lady and her father went out, now reappeared and beckoned to Jerry, who in the slackened interest could easily get near him. "Jerry, if you wish to take something you eat, you can, but keep in the way. You will be sure to hear when the jury come in. Don't be a moment behind them, for I want you to take the verdict back to the bank." So he says, that's the reason that you've been here, is I want you to bring this verdict back. "You are the quickest messenger I know, and will get to Temple Bar long before I can." Jerry had enough forehead to knuckle, and he knuckled it in acknowledgment of this communication and a shilling. Mr. Carton came up at the moment and touched Mr. Lorry on the arm. "How is the young lady?" "She's greatly distressed, but her father is comforting her, and she feels the better for being out of court. I'll tell the prisoner so. It won't do for a respectable bank gentleman like you to be seen speaking to him publicly, you know." Mr. Lorry reddened as if he were conscious of having debated the point in his mind, and Mr. Carton made his way to the outside of the bar. The way out of the court lay in that direction, and Jerry followed him, all eyes, ears, and spikes. "Mr. Darnay," the prisoner came forward directly, "you will naturally be anxious to hear of the witness, Miss Manette. She will do very well. You have seen the worst of her agitation." So this is Carton and Darnay speaking. "I am deeply sorry to have been the cause of it. Could you tell her so for me with my fervent acknowledgments?" "Yes, I could. I will, if you ask it." Mr. Carton's manner was so careless as to be almost insolent. He stood, half turned from the prisoner, lounging with his elbow against the bar. So again, that appearance of not caring, not being interested, but again, not so much the reality. "I do ask it and accept my cordial thanks." "What?" said Carton, still only half turned toward him. "Do you expect, Mr. Darnay?" "The worst." "It's the wisest thing to expect and the likeliest. But I think their withdrawing is in your favor," says Carton. Loitering on the way out of court, not being allowed, Jerry heard no more but left them, so like each other in feature, so unlike each other in manner, standing side by side, both reflected in the glass above them. So there's still that mirror that's like shining down on them. An hour and a half limped heavily away in the thief and rascal crowded passages below, even though assisted off with the mutton pies and ale. The hoarse messenger, uncomfortably seated on a form after taking that reflection, had dropped into a doze, when a loud murmur and a rapid tide of people setting up the stairs that led to the court carried him among them. "Jerry, Jerry," Mr. Lorry was already calling at the door when he got there. "Here, sir, it's a fight to get back again." "Here I am, sir." Mr. Lorry handed him a paper through the throng. "Quick, have you got it?" "Yes, sir." Hastily written on the paper was the word "acquitted." "If you had sent the message recalled to life," again muttered Jerry as he turned, "I should have known what you meant this time." He had no opportunity of saying or so much as thinking anything until he was clear of the Old Bailey, for the crowd came pouring out with a vehemence that nearly took him off his legs, and a loud buzz swept into the street as if the baffled blue flies were dispersing in search of another carrion. So, think about why this chapter is called a disappointment. The word acquitted means that he's set free. And think about how, so Jerry brings up recalled to life, but think about how that's also relevant here. So initially, recalled to life was just about Dr. Manette, but now recalled to life is connected to Charles Darnay. And that's it.